Hello and welcome back to the Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno from 1989 to 1996. Okay, so this is the big one. The year that many classics were released. The year that my provisional list of albums to potentially cover ran to several hundred. Also the year that saw the release of a number of records that pointed away from the chill out rooms and towards new kinds of ambient and electronic listening music. It's 1994. Where the hell do I start? Let's start with Silent, shall we? And Michael Mantra's Sonic Alter. As with a number of Silent releases, this is one of those where the ambient scene meets New Age, in the New Age thinking, alternative lifestyle meaning of the term. Sonic Alter is a record containing binaural beats, that is, the meeting of sine waves in the stereo field that create a third tone midway between the two. The album's booklet goes into detail about how this can affect different brainwaves and incite various mental states, although the actual scientific validity of these remains questionable. Nevertheless, binaural beats are often used to help with meditation, and there's quite an element of that here. Over the 3 22-minute tracks we are treated to sine waves and ocean waves, throat singing, whale song, and weirdly samples of laughter. The result ends up being more unsettling than relaxing, creating a genuinely surreal sonic landscape. Back in more recognisably ambient house territory is the compilation UFA, Unidentified Floating Ambience. UFA is a compilation in name only. Despite the 4 artist names involved, all 8 tracks here are produced by Kim Cascone, Don Falcone and Paul Nayrink. Cascone was of course the owner of Silent, while Falcone was a long-time collaborator of Gong's David Allen, who contributed to the debut Heavenly Music Corporation album. Nayrink was, alongside Falcone, a member of early Silent post-industrial act Thessalonians. The trio are best known for their 1995 album Future Perfect State, released as the Spice Barons. Many consider this the debut Spice Barons album in all but name. Why was the album done this way? No idea. Maybe there are subtle differences in style between the names. Spice Barons are slightly more on the spacey, drony end of things, Pattern Clear more minimal, Hydrosphere slightly more rhythmic, and Astral Fish more experimental, but it's all very subtle and nothing compared to the stylistic variation on many single artist albums. There are some truly fantastic tracks here, which is the most important thing. Crescent-Headed Star and Cogito Ergo Om by Spice Barons are particular highlights, but everything here is top drawer 90s synth music. Astral Fish's Stardust probably goes on for a bit too long, but otherwise it's a superb collection of atmospheric ambience. Cascone's second solo album as Heavenly Music Corporation almost puts his debut to shame with how much of a step up it is. Consciousness 3 is 70 minutes of immaculate ambient techno, this time expanding the wispy drum machines to encompass most of the album, but never diverting away from the gorgeous melodies and fluffy soft synths of Inner Garden of Eden. It's difficult to pick out individual tracks as they all combine to create a wonderfully flowing whole, the subtle tonal differences most evident when listened to start to finish. Cloud Chamber has a fittingly airy feel, while Inner Dimensional's field recordings ground the pieces to reality. Opener Flowers and Beads is a real highlight, with overt techno influences that could have pushed it for inclusion in Warp's Artificial Intelligence series. Maybe the peak is Closer riding Windhorse, a singular drone track with a truly irresistible atmosphere that at 7 minutes feels far too short. With its quiet field recordings and glassy textures, it's one of the most truly relaxing pieces of music I've ever heard, and I could happily sink into its ambient stillness for hours. A fine end to a fantastic album and a label highlight. With perhaps one of the worst covers to come from the whole era, and an artist name that is a little on the nose to say the least, Transcendental Anarchists' Cluster Zone isn't really a promising album on the surface. One shouldn't judge an album by its cover, however, and there really is a lot to like about this record. Opener Sixth Sense is a tense 7 minutes of electronic effects and chilling synth drones, very much evoking the spacey imagery of the back cover, and to an extent the front. Sub Aqua collages various electronic sounds over the quietest of kicks, resembling a distant heartbeat more than anything to dance to. Epiphany features joyous synth arpeggios with a skipping beat. 15-minute The Ether is a drone piece that travels through several movements, while the title track and Pyramids on Mars are both dubby. The whole thing has a peculiar minimalism to it in its arrangements, most likely through it being, like many Silent releases, the work of non-professional musicians with limited gear. Despite this, it still stands up as a solid album. It's not on the same level as the classics, but it's absolutely worth a listen for those looking deeper into the genre. I'm always wary of artists who use genre names in their own name. Largely it reeks of lack of imagination. The name Ambient Temple of Imagination has its own kind of irony in that context. A collection of freethinkers in San Francisco, led by Richard Sun and Seophon, ATOI created chill-out spaces at raves, and the double-E'd Th's and K's in the magic suggest at least some awareness of the Temple of Psychic Youth. There's a stylistic similarity in places to some of Genesis P-Orig's material. The opening couple of tracks on debut album Mystery School are intense, with pretty heavy rhythms and little in the way to describe its atmosphere, leading to the suspicion that this is ambient in name only. After that, things do calm down somewhat, and we're left with a run of textural tracks that feature field recordings and dusty electronics that are sometimes very evocative. The clanging bells and morose pads of the title track suggest a grimly dystopian cityscape, while light in extension falls closer to the ethno-tribal soundscapes of many other artists. On the whole, it's a busy, dense work that feels like the opposite of what many people expect from ambient. There's very little opportunity for relaxation here, with Mystery School ultimately coming across as an intense, even exhausting listen. Ambient Temple of Imagination sound like no one else, but they are somewhat of an acquired taste. One of the most fondly remembered records from Silent is 23 Degrees and Endless Searching for Substance. A trio of musicians with almost no other credits to their name, 23 Degrees recorded 2 albums for Silent before completely disappearing. This debut was also released on Solar Quest's Entropica label in the UK with a bonus disc of outtakes and remixes 4 years later. Like many of the era's best, it's a varied work, open as the start of an unfinished chain reaction, giving the idea that this is going to be a dub record, for a sudden dive into deep blue waters with the beautiful beatless The End of New Beginnings. Radio Free Ian combines dub basslines with deep house and ambient sampling, while the ethnic sampling and percussion of Nagsbandi Escape Hatch brings things closer to tribal ambient territory. This combination of ethno-ambient dub and deep house leads the way for the bulk of the record, and it's a selection of styles that are quite unusual for Silent, whose regular blissful synth works are absent here. The ambient dub project of industrial techno quartet Technogod, Ohmega Tribe, released their soul album Anodyne Wisdom on the Italian label Alchemax Industries in '94. It was subsequently given a reissue on Silent in '95, as well as on short-lived German imprint Wigwam. The Bandcamp reissue uses the Silent cover and cites the label in the blurb, suggesting it was through Cascone's imprint that the album received most exposure. One of Silent's least memorable albums, Anodyne Wisdom is a perfectly functional piece of dubby ambient techno, but one that contains very little that hasn't been done better elsewhere. Gentle techno beats, deep bass, synth arpeggios, a few ethnic vocal samples. It feels like an early example of the kind of filler material that began to be churned out by '94 and would end up taking over in the following couple of years. A third From Here to Tranquility compilation was inevitable at this point, once again featuring a mixture of silent artists and one-off projects by amateurs. Amusingly, the liner notes offer a graph of ambient artists, noting their position on 2 axes marked emotional commitment and intellectual interaction. FSOL are in the top right, scoring highly on both, with Global Communication in the orb somewhere near the middle. Jorg Reyes and Spacetime Continuum score lowly on intellectual interaction, with the KLF located around the bottom left alongside Weather field recordings. Namluke has 2 bubbles for reasons. With diversions into trance and lo-fi sound art, it's a less cohesive compilation than previous volumes, although it shows the label wasn't standing still. Silent also put out a few records with closer ties to its earlier style, including Bliss by Pelican Daughters, which, despite some very 90s ambient style art, is all musique concrète, oddball post-punk and unclassifiable experiments. There's still ambient on there, and those who picked the album up based on it being on Silent would have no doubt enjoyed pieces like Saxophone and Chalk Piano, Prisms and Remote Viewing. Illusion of Safety's Water Seeks Its Own Level, thankfully, came in a less overtly Silent-esque cover, potentially protecting some wary listeners from its noisy, if remarkably creative, musique concrète. Similarly, the gritty drone of Faust's God T. Faust was at least visually very different to the usual Silent fare. Psychick TV's 1989 album Condole was also re-edited and expanded with new material for release on the label. The tribal drums and whale sounds no doubt having some crossover appeal, although the tone is unsurprisingly a lot darker than anything in ambient house. There was also a one-off excursion into ambient leaning shoegave with Nearfield's Close Down. Although an active part of the San Francisco scene, Spacetime Continuum's Jonah Sharp continued to work with Astralworks in the US for his debut solo album Biscuit, with the album's European distribution handled by Fax. One of the big albums of '94, Biscuit refines and perfects the ambient techno sound. Crisp Detroit-inspired beats, solid bass and intertwining melodies and sequences form the basis of the first 5 tracks here, each individual yet forming a consistent whole. The clicks and pops of Pressure show Sharp incorporating elements of IDM without succumbing to the style's frequent coldness, while Subway throws shade onto the sound with cavernous dubby drums and darker, more abstract melodies. Ping Pong's arpeggios are reminiscent of Global Communications' epic sound, while Voice of the Earth and Flotilla turn the warmth right up into euphoric chill. There's a subtle change in tone for the final two tracks, with Q11 taking on a melancholic vibe, wistful synth pads overlaid with voicemail messages from Sharp's friend in prison, who's staying in cell Q11, before the piece develops into layers of delay-soaked percussion reminiscent of FSOL's spaciest tracks. And on the subject of spacey, a low-frequency inversion field named after a line from Star Trek The Next Generation is a voyage deep into the unknown, choral pads playing eerie melodies over a monolithic drone texture. While not released on Silent, the Astralworks release does fit in with that label's aesthetic, with sleeve design from Silent regular Andrew Frith. With superb composition and a perfect mix, Biscuit wouldn't be perfected in this area of rhythmic ambient techno, a high point of the genre. While Sharp's only solo record of '94, he did contribute to 3 more albums, 2 of which will be covered when I get to Namlook and Fax. The other was a collaboration with David Mufang as Reagenz. An incredible impromptu session, Sharp recalls the story of how it was made. David just turned up in San Francisco and knocked my door. He said, "I'm from Germany, I have a label, I love your label." The next day, David and I went into the studio and made what became the first Reagenz album, literally the day after we met. Namlook knew David and knew that I'd been doing events in San Francisco where I was bringing over the best ambient and techno artists, Sharp says. Pete called me up and said, "Why haven't you called me?" He offered to pay his way to come over and play. He arrived with his synth. I felt honoured. His Fax label was just emerging at the time, and what he did at one of our shows in San Francisco ended up being released as an album. The self-titled Reagenz album starts out very much in the ambient IDM mode of Spacetime Continuum, with 4 tracks recorded at Sharp's Reflective Studios in San Francisco, all skittering drum machines and atmospheric pads. The spontaneous nature of the session means the pieces have a little less of the tightly managed structures of Sharp's solo works, but at the same time the infectious energy of some of these tracks could only have been born as a result of the improvisational nature of the recording. The second half of the album is a result of a trip to Mufang's Resource studio in Heidelberg and shifts slightly away from the atmospherics towards a colder, more rhythm-forward sound. The 2 sessions combine perfectly to create a superb whole on an early IDM album with a brightness and spaciousness not found in much of the warp-related scene at the time. It was released on the 2 members' own labels, Reflective and Source, with different running orders. Since 2001 it's been in print on vinyl thanks to the Swiss Musique pour la Danse label. I'll now skip over to the opposite coast of the US for the launch of Instinct Ambient. Having put out a handful of ambient albums in '93, some licensed from European labels, as well as their own Chill Out compilation, all promising the next stage in the techno evolution, New York's Instinct set up a dedicated sub-label in '94, Instinct Ambient. Taylor Dupree took the role as lead designer for the label, with the sleeves mostly bearing his artwork. The imprint debuted with Chill Out Phase 2, the follow-up to the first Chill Out compilation, featuring a mixture of tracks from upcoming Instinct Ambient albums and pieces licensed from European labels from the likes of The Irresistible Force, Orbital, Aphex Twin, Drum Club, Sad World and Sun Electric. As a brief aside, I won't be covering Orbital in this series because I really don't consider them ambient, although they do seem to appear on these compilations all the time. Dupree's sleeve design is very much of its time, but has a particular stylishness, a sleek semi-minimalism with excellent typography, that sets his covers apart from the more garish psychedelic sleeves of many ambient records of the time. Following his Straylight album on Recycle or Die, Dominic Woozy returns here with a new alias, Mysteries of Science. Adopting a similar sound to Straylight but with a stronger trancier bent, Mysteries of Science is a blend of beatless Berlin School pulse and ambient trance. Woozy's ear for melody is at the fore throughout, but we also get tribal beats in the interweave conundrum. The mellotron flute in Giza Nightscape brings strong images of Tangerine Dream, or the 30-minute River of Black Ice hints at minimal techno. 2 pieces from the album, the superb opener and closer, are included on a Mysteries of Science 12-inch compilation released on the wonderful Rediscovery label. Terre Thaemlitz's debut album Tranquilizer finds the artist in typically confrontational mode, with an album that heads into unusual territories. Opener 040468 is a stupendously good ambient piece, a brooding melange of synth and shuffling percussion. After that we're into Fat Chair with plucked synth notes and field recordings leading into a cascade of spoken samples, offering a more unusual textural experience. Roar Through a Straw is an oddity, sounding like an 11-minute improvisation for underwater Hammond organ that leads into breakbeats and some piano smashing. Meditation of the Mountain Oyster is ambience for sub-bass tones and tabla, while A City on Springs is minimalism to the point of barely there, although the incredibly subtle atmosphere this piece of sound art creates is utterly engaging. Just when you think you've got the hand of Thaemlitz as abstraction, she throws in a jazzy trip-hop piece on hovering glows and glitched percussion on the watery 2 AM on a silo. The whole thing shimmers with a strange crepuscular melancholy, but each listen provides new surprises. This is genuinely experimental music infused with ambient house elements, and the result is a surprisingly effective combination of challenge and comfort. SETI is a project by Taylor Dupree and Savas Isatis, aka Human Mesh Dance and Omicron. The pair recorded together under a number of aliases, starting here with the self-titled SETI. Named after the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the project have included liner notes on the subject, this time including astronomer Frank Drake's equation for calculating the potential number of civilizations in the Milky Way. Combined with the satellite dishes on the cover, there's a distinct theme here, one of computers seeking out potential radio signals from the vast swathes of nothingness that form the majority of the universe. Fittingly, the music is quiet, minimal, chillingly cold, and frequently consisting of long drawn-out drones, single bleeping notes, and sparse clicking beats. Presented as a single unbroken 56-minute track consisting of 10 separate signals, the album is as minimal as post-rave ambient had ever really gone upon its release in June '94. The clinical, scientific theme is remarkable in stark contrast with the lush, colourful psychedelia of the hippie-ish ambient coming from Silent around the same time. When we think of electronic space music, the names that come to mind usually are Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze, maybe the earlier works of Robert Rich and Steve Roach, but SETI are in many ways the ultimate space music group, creating music that is as cold, unfriendly and unknowable as the vast nothingness of the universe. One half of SETI, Savas Isatis, is also known for his music as Omicron, and he released his debut album, Acrocosm, as part of Instinct Ambient's 1994 lineup. Eschewing the trance of his earlier EP, here Isatis gives us 70 minutes of gently flowing electronica, beautiful synth pads over shuffling mid-tempo techno beats. Of all the Instinct artists, Omicron's music feels the closest link to that of Fax, with a very similar aesthetic to many of Namluke's collaborations. Opener Earthrider is a particularly beautiful piece, while Warped Upward heads into more jarring territory with layers of synth noise and shards of 303. It isn't all ambient techno, with tracks like Luna and Spaced Nature being beatless improvised synth. Caterpillar to Butterfly is reminiscent of Reload, and Tranquility Bass's lush textures wouldn't feel out of place on an FSOL album. 1,000 Dies on the Moist Earth takes influence from the harder edge of British IDM. There's even quiet industrial dub on Orca and twinkling sequencer music on the glorious One Voice. Although nowhere near as minimal as SETI, Isatis' work here as Omicron shares a synthetic coldness with that album. Its textures and atmosphere is not especially welcoming, but incredibly captivating if you're into the darker end of the genre. As well as designing covers, Dupree also released his second Human Mesh Dance in '94, building on the sounds of '93's Higher Line. Bizarrely, despite an album bearing the name the year before, it wasn't until this second album, Mindflower, that the track called Higher Line appeared. Echoing the trancier aspects of his debut, Dupree here creates a serene environment filled with suspended air and stationary objects, skeletal melodies and occasional start beat set in a sea of static gaseous synth drones. Tracks like Wet Moon and Skyflower already preempt the stark minimalism of his 12K material at the end of the decade, and the darker, sparser sound here is symbolic of the East Coast ambient sound of the time. As well as fostering homegrown talent, Instinct Ambient also licensed a handful of releases from other labels, including Deep Space Network's marvellous Big Rooms album from Source, Cabaret Voltaire's The Conversation from Apollo, and 0094, the debut compilation release on the UK's Emmet Records. More on those last two in later videos. Though still having some crossover with other labels, Instinct Ambient's first year really showed the label as one to watch, developing its own distinct sound with a colder, darker and more minimal take on ambient techno that would initially be at odds with many of '94's biggest albums, but would prove incredibly influential in years to come. I hope you enjoyed today's video. That's all for now, and please do leave me some comments below. I'd love to know what you think of this material, especially from those people who were there at the time. There are also like, subscribe and share buttons below you might like to press. And for those of you who use Spotify, check down below in the video description. There should be a link to a Spotify playlist that accompanies this series of videos. I'll be updating that with all the material I cover every time a video comes out. Next time I'll be moving on to some of the bigger British labels of 1994, and I hope to see you then.